I'm John Clippinger. I'm with the MIT Media Lab and also CEO and founder of something called ID Cubed, which is an Institute for Data-Driven Design. And the intent there is to how do you develop new kinds of digital institutions, as we call them, to deal with the problem of how people protect and share their data, and how to develop new models of governance. The topic today is cybersecurity, which is extremely apropos given all the events and the press of the last 6 months. And what we'd like to discuss is sort of the contradiction between, on the one hand, of a government that aggressively has its own cyber warfare objectives and things like StuckNet. On the other hand, you have an obligation to protect the citizenry, and people have privacy rights. And we're seeing these contradictions becoming more and more pronounced as the technology grows. And a lot of people think about cybersecurity only in the context of computers, but as everything is becoming digitalized and connected, I mean, this came out in a number of different sessions. So you're going to have your heart monitor giving data about yourself, your car giving data about yourself. So virtually all aspects of your life and your movement are going to be generating data and being collected and used by some party. The question is, what kind of control do you have over that? Who has the right to use it in various kinds of ways? And what kind of institutional arrangements can we develop that both at the same time protect the data and allow for a appropriate kind of security posture on the part of a government? It's a classic old problem like who guards the guards. At some point, you're creating institutions that are supposed to protect people. On the other hand, you're giving them enormous kind of powers. We've got an extremely distinguished panel here of people who provide different perspectives on these cybersecurity issues. They're seasoned professionals and have been studying this for quite some time. And what I do is have them begin and introduce themselves very briefly, and then be able to have them and then address this question, this sort of fundamental paradox that we're seeing is becoming accentuated. And then we'll have a series of more interactions following up from that, and then we want to open it up to the floor. Jane, could you just introduce yourself?
I'm Jean Camp. I am a professor of informatics. And do you want to do introductions and then remarks?
Well, just to make a few more remarks at yourself.
Okay. So my interest is in helping people protect themselves. Security, we all have heard, is a public good, and we need, the government out there to protect us against the bad people. And we know it's a private good because we all buy our antivirus. But it's also something else. It's a commons that we need to collectively protect. And the way, when we do neighborhood watch, we don't put a video camera on every door and send that to the government. Some of the most effective mechanisms in stopping offline crime and improving our environment and our air quality are community coordination. And that's what I work on. I design systems to help people secure themselves and their friends. So that's a different way to approach privacy and security than than either purchasing it from a private provider who then gets your data or sending your data to government, but rather so that your community can solve your security problem and do it collectively and still maintain control of your own data. And that's a technical challenge, that how do we redesign systems or add systems to the ones that exist to empower us.
Great, thank you.
So I'm Marvin Amori. My expertise is not on the technical side, but on the legal side. I'm a lawyer I have my own law firm in DC. My clients include Dropbox, Google, WordPress.com. I do work for them on privacy, freedom of expression, and other issues involving public policy, including things we'll discuss today. If you want to know my sort of orientation, I'm also on the board of a few nonprofit advocacy groups, including Fight for the Future and Demand Progress, which was founded by Aaron Schwartz, two of the organizations that have been fighting for greater transparency and privacy in the whole NSA scandal. So I have an activist component and then a sort of traditional legal component, and was a law professor for 3 years, actually.
Great. Hi, I'm Michelle Dennedy. I'm the Vice President and Chief Privacy Officer for McAfee, so thank you for buying your antivirus software and other platform protections. We like that. So I am the privacy person on the panel. And so my perspective of security versus privacy is really an and rather than an or. And so I think that there is a framework to be found, maybe not the one we have today, that respects that privacy really by definition is the selective sharing of personal information. And the selections that we make are culturally bound, whether you are in a collective context or whether you're in a more individual determinative state. But I do agree with this state of commons. When you take that view of privacy as selective sharing rather than sequestration or ultimate secrecy, I think it then informs and enhances the dialogue we can have in this security and privacy mixed world. The history has told us that just security alone versus privacy model always systematically and violently does not work.
I'm Shuman Gosmajumder. I'm Vice President of Strategy at Shape Security. Prior to that, I managed click fraud protection at Google for a number of years. I think that one of the fundamental issues that we face with cybersecurity today is figuring out what we do as the internet overall, as the web overall, in terms of being able to protect our machines, our infrastructure, considering that the vast majority of the users of those technologies aren't going to be security experts. They're not going to understand all of the various ways that are required to be able to secure their machines, let alone being able to secure more complex pieces of infrastructure. So you look at just the simplest mechanisms that exist right now to be able to connect to the internet, your home Wi-Fi networks and your cable providers, and the majority of folks that are using those types of technologies don't know how to be able to secure even those very simple mechanisms. So I think that as we're seeing a greater ubiquity of all of these technologies, we need to figure out as an industry what default applications and what default technologies do we put in place to provide protection for all of the folks that are going to be using it now and in the future.
Wow, what a panel. So my name is Stefan Verhulst. I'm a senior advisor to the Markle Foundation, where I was a chief of research for 12 years. And the foundation focuses on the use of IT to address critical public needs. And so in that context, we've done a lot of work on health information and how you can actually share that information. We've done a lot of work on national security post 9/11. We've done a lot of work on cybersecurity, on energy, and how you can transform the energy grid and so on. And so privacy and security was always a common theme across the sectors. And I will mention something about that. But I'm also now a co-founder and chief of research at a new organization at NYU, which is called the Governance Laboratory. And the Governance Laboratory, as the name indicates, looks at how you can actually use new technologies to change how we govern, which was the theme of a session here yesterday. Now, just a few opening remarks. This is a huge topic, of course, and I think it's very hard to start off and make sense to a certain extent. But I think if we take stock, I think what really needs to happen is an understanding and a better debate, from my point of view, about what kind of uses and what kind of security intrusions are really legitimate and also really troubling as a society. And I think there may be a lot of uses, and there is a panel this afternoon about big data as well, that have privacy implications, but that from a societal perspective are actually uses that are beneficial and can also be seen as actually less harmful on an individual's autonomy, if that's what we care about with regard to privacy, as opposed to other uses that are really troubling and that you really want to a certain extent, prevent and work towards that. And I'm focusing on the use, and the same thing for security intervention. I mean, we've had a lot of debate about red lines and that kind of stuff with regard to Syria. I think the same thing needs to happen with regard to security. What is really a red line that you cannot live with and that should be approached? And the reason why I'm saying that is because if you start focusing on collection, disclosure, from my point of view, this is becoming harder and harder and harder to impose limits on the collection and the sharing. And so we're going to have to become far more sophisticated about what uses do you want to have limited as opposed to what collections do you want to have limited.
Well, let me follow up on that and put some questions to the panel, because I mean, a lot of the policies around privacy and the way that's framed are come out of the 70s, really, before the internet, before mobile wireless, before Internet of Things. And it was computer-centric, it's fair information practices, principles, there's all those ideas. And the harms we're seeing really in coming and releasing something that shouldn't be released, but actually the huge number of harms in not having the data flow. Now we're in a whole nother arena where actually we're immersed in a data environment. We're collecting, and there are processes that are absolutely dependent upon the data flowing, and flowing in a credible way. And as a result of that, I think there's sort of a breakdown in all kinds of sort of governance and legal frameworks, and how to think about this and how to frame it,
Right.
and how to really restate sort of what people's rights are, what the state's rights are. And I think there's some really interesting work that's been done by Eleanor Ostrom at Indiana, who's a Nobel laureate in economics, the only woman to get it. And she talked about how do you do the management of a common pool resource. And she had studied over a number of years how traditional societies were able to manage basically water flows. Now, it wasn't a property regime, it was a rights regime. And actually, there have been some really interesting computer simulations work done at Imperial College about how to develop governance mechanisms based upon that. So there are like 6 principles that you apply how to govern commons, because it's a public good, it's a private good. And you have problems of free riders and unintended consequences. And you also have, when you're doing new things, they're going to change very rapidly, and you have to have some process that quickly it heals itself, corrects itself, rather than go in a protracted litigation process. At least I believe that. So I want to sort of open that up to the group, and maybe you're taking this community perspective in a sense and looking at this and saying it is among the community, but because it's an expression of the community. I mean, it's this idea that it's sort of this just data, and actually it's people's lives, it's how they're seen, it's how they're treated, is becoming more and more important. So there may be a different kind of legal framework to think about these things, and a different kind of governance framework that is more distributed, and less based upon the more traditional frameworks that we looked at. I mean, do you have some ideas on that? And because she was at Indiana, she
Yes,
had her
and
center there and did a lot of work.
And how do you build that? If you want to do it with privacy, how do you build it? So take something like a botnet or a phishing attack. That harm is going to be similar for everyone. If you have more money, you lose more money in a phishing attack. But take something like a picture of a person drinking a beer. We had a teacher who was over 21 on vacation in Germany. She was fired from a public school system for drinking a beer in Germany. If you're under 21, you could lose a scholarship. If you are in a custody battle, you could lose access to your kids. If you're me, you could have people say, "Ooh, I can't believe you drank that light beer," right? I mean, the harms are so different in privacy that it makes a rule-based kind of this is prohibited,
Right.
Ex ante approach very hard, because we don't know what the harm is going to be. Each one of us could have very different harms from exactly the same information. So, Google tries to solve the heterogeneous problem of security for the internet, but communities have very homogeneous standards. And if we can empower those communities to work together, if we can solve the problem of security, for you and your 2 friends, and then for you and your 2 friends, assuming you're not friends, we have much more data to look at. So, the Financial Times attack, is everybody familiar with that? They got them to enter their passwords, even though they're not at all naive, into a Syrian website. Now that was a 2-pronged attack. So first of all, they immediately spread information. The other thing they did that was really important is they made clear to the rebels and dissidents that they could do this, that they better not talk to the Financial Times. Now, if you're trying to solve the problem of the whole internet and what's trusted and what's not trusted, that may be solvable. But if you're trying to solve the problem for the Financial Times, and we're building a system that does this, because I think that the Commons framework can work. And if I believe it works as someone in an informatics school, the way I show it works is I build it.
Well, there's a notion of a data commons that's come up, and it's an open data, and an idea of a data commons. Is that something that you're talking about? And that is a vehicle for doing something like this? Or?
No, I'm talking about treating communities as communities. So the Financial Times doesn't want the New York Times to know every place they look at. But if you just built it for them, the computer knew when they connected to the Syrian site that it was from a remote network address,
Right.
that it was from a site nobody's ever been to before, that it had a certificate that was characterized very differently from all the other certificates. So to get the computer to tell the individual or the community without requiring that that community or individual, with all due respect, give up all their data to a corporate or governmental third party, that privacy can enhance security, that we can make security work if we allow people to build their own
You want to
communities.
respond to that? Yes.
I more want to ask a question. So when I think of communities being able to engage in their own security, I also think of the NSA program Bull Run, right, where the NSA was attempting to subvert some of the encryption standards that are global. Right? And so if you are a local community trying to secure networks and there's a global vulnerability, it just seems like there has to be some sort of concern for the global security as well. And also when I think of communities trying to secure their own networks, I think of some of the countries that are now saying things like, because we can't trust the NSA, we need to make sure that Google and Dropbox have servers in this country here, and we're going to have a sovereign cloud in this country or that country, Brazil, France, you name it, China.
Right.
And once you have people on the ground and you have servers in those countries for their local community security needs, you then have not only a balkanized internet, but you can compromise that information more easily. So I've just seen the arguments being used differently. So I'm just sort of asking, am I wrong to think that these sort of global trends matter?
I guess I have
Maybe the second one wasn't responsive, but I think the first might have been.
two answers to that. Because we have Neighborhood Watch does not mean we do not have Interpol. And I think these technologies are absolutely complementary, and you've got to have them at both levels. Bull Run and Manassas, well, everybody's talking about, Q and P and the relationship between Q and P, and
Could you elaborate what you mean by Q and P?
Yes. People are saying that the 2007 presentation that illustrated if you had a particular mathematical function, you could predict all the randomness and thus read everything. But that was only for that one point. Now, if you look at Cisco and Microsoft, they chose not to use that particular instantiation of the standard. So even when the standard came out, as a government, you don't have to say, we don't trust the NSA. You could say, oh, well, we're only going to accept implementations of this type. I guess it was kind of technically subtle.
But I understand. I understand. Communities could still decide we don't want that global standard. It wasn't being forced.
But it
on them.
wasn't a whole standard. They said, well, here's a number you can use, and that's the number we're all talking about. And they said, but if you want to make up your own number, here's the way to make up your own number, which is why you're seeing about half of industry hit by this. And you have to acknowledge that the NSA, this is such a radical policy change, right? The NSA has a history of improving security, right? If you look at what they did with earlier security standards in the 70s, they changed the standards, and then in the 90s, these amazing new attacks came out, and it turns out, gosh, those changes the NSA made actually made it strong against those attacks we didn't know existed yet, 20 years later. So it's not like there wasn't reason to engage in that trust. It wasn't like the corporations were conspiring with them.
I didn't say that.
I mean,
Michelle, do you want to respond to this? Because this idea between sort of community versus a more global perspective,
Yeah, it's interesting. So again, the verses, so negative, so negative.
Okay.
It's always
No,
and, right?
We
It's
do the
always
and.
and,
Yes,
because
okay.
an individual
Conjunction.
exists within a community and which exists within the global community, right? Which sounds very Pollyanna and cool. However, I think what it reflects is down to the very point of these specific factors in a specific instance, in a specific year, as publicly reported to a crypto audience. I mean, you're getting down to a microcosm of I won't say virus, because that's not what it was. It was a defect of sort. It was an oops of sort. But that one defect can then go up the funnel and impact entire nation states' credibility. I mean, that to me is the remarkable point, because I think what it means for system build out. Now, I'm a psychology major with a law degree. I mean, I was basically unemployable, so I had to go to graduate school. I'm not a computer scientist. I just play one during the day. However, I do know a lot about this stuff, particularly on the identity side. When you talk about individuals participating within a community, you inherently start to talk about more artful, efficient, beautiful ways of getting to granularity. And I think in the past, we had the right kinds of newness and the right kinds of just the right amount and just the right in time of Moore's law capacity, where you could build these giant file sharing things, and then you could buy bigger file sharing things, and now we still have these bigger. Now we're kind of looking at organic models. How do we self-heal? How do we recognize? How do we look at something, and I know there's going to be a native Chinese speaker, and I apologize for butchering, but it's called a hukao? Am I saying it correctly? Correct. Okay, because every time I say hukao, some Chinese nationalist stands up and goes, no, it's hukao. Okay, but anyway, it's and you can describe it much better, but it's a document that basically says your provenance as a human being, and that document allows you certain rights and privileges, and it is that granular kind of identity management for 1 billion people in China. Now, is it effective? Is that the solution to create, instead of a social security number, a more granulated, big government top-down credential? Yeah. Hell no. It's not working for the Chinese either. There's lots of kids that don't get one, and they don't get educated in services and all sorts of things. However, what it does reflect is we all, just like the millions of diverse cells in our bodies, have common elements at the very bottom, and if you have that DNA defect, you too will have a systemic problem. But we also have these wonderful protein markers, and I think that's how to consider privacy development, is really the development of these protein markers that can recognize externalities, can adapt to nutritional factors, and can couple with unlike things to create new things. You know, much like in the maternal, kind of the mystery of the maternal immunity, where you should be rejecting a fetus as having half wrong DNA that doesn't match. But your body's figured it out. We can design computer systems if we're taking this very personal view, which in my mind, again, is what the inherency of privacy, and that's why I think it is very much an and.
Well, so you're proposing almost like a biological model of governance that's highly distributed based on biology, right?
That's what I'm
proposing. And where does that come from? Who's going to?
So who owns it, right?
Well, not who owns it, but just like, okay, there's a different governance model, a whole different set of principles.
That's what I was going to press to Stefan.
I always agree. Yeah.
But so, you know, I mean, I'm not sure that I can see the Republican Party doing that anytime soon.
They can't talk about
I don't know what vehicles that. What is the vehicle for that to be? How's that they come to pass?
To even be instantiated.
And be understood, but why that's a need for it. But Stefan, you're nodding, so I can throw this right at. You should be designing these kind of things, right? There's this.
Well, and you should be designing those things with a particular understanding of what the norms will be that inform the decisions that ultimately the system will make, right? Meaning, so you can have all kinds of wonderful algorithmic systems that identify a threat and identify a possible privacy abuse, but then the algorithm has to be built upon an understanding of what's the norm that you ultimately want to achieve. And I think what I tried to say at my opening remarks is that we need to have a new understanding about what the adequate norms will be in this field, with the understanding that certain kinds of practices are actually wonderful based upon based upon the availability of more information and based upon the concept of an open internet, right? But the fact that, and a global internet, by the way, right? So because if you start, I agree, if you start balkanizing it, then you might actually lose out on certain things, and I know that's not what you advocate for, but I just want to state here. And so what I advocate for, or what I mention here, is that, as you indicated, the Fair Information Practices, they celebrated their 30th year anniversary last year. Obviously, that was a different world. They're still the best that we have. But guess what? It doesn't work anymore, and there's one element that doesn't work anymore, which is this purpose specification. i.e.,
Yes.
you cannot know in advance how the information is going to be used, because now you have far more aggregation. Today in the Financial Times, in the front page, Axiom is launching a new kind of way that bypasses the cookie system, that is all about aggregating information in a manner that you never had before. So what I'm saying is that we've moved in an era where a lot of the information is flowing, where a lot of the security challenges are harder and harder to solve. So we're going to have a reflection on what kind of society do we want to live in, and what kind of uses are really off, and what kind of uses are beneficial.
But you're still, I mean, if you look at the notification and consent, and the whole way this is being framed today is still within the old
It's still
paradigm.
old model, and that's
So,
what I say. It doesn't work.
The quote, the legitimate institutions that they're chartered with doing this are still resonating with the old form. I mean, and so they're not going to provide a solution.
Yeah.
So it's sort of
no, they totally break it down.
maybe you want to have a comment because you were saying you proposed an approach, and so you're hearing a pretty radical set of propositions here. I mean,
Well,
to your right and to your left.
I think that the suggestion that was made earlier about being able to have internet technologies and permissions and policies reflect individual communities is a very interesting one, but it's extremely difficult to implement from a technical perspective for a couple of reasons. So for one reason, it's if you've got something which is implemented in policy by an organization. Right. So you've got something like a social network, and you have different privacy settings, and you say that this content is tagged to be shared with this community, this content is tagged to be shared with a separate community, then that's essentially putting all of your data in a place which is one bug away from suddenly being exposed, or one breach away from suddenly being exposed. So that's one particular technical challenge. But another technical challenge is where you have different community regulations or privacy policies or laws that are actually contradicting one another. So in some parts of the world, there are data retention requirements. In other parts of the world, there are data deletion requirements. What happens when data is actually the interaction of two different people from each of those communities? So you have an email which is sent. Who owns that email? How do you delete it from one location where you've got a data retention requirement, and so on? So I think that one of the fundamental challenges that we have as far as how the internet has grown is the fact that it has just grown so fast that it's really difficult for laws, it's certainly international laws, but also individual country laws, even the fastest moving countries, to be able to keep pace with the level of technology that exists today.
I'd like to just make one small add. I mean, one of the things that we're doing both at MIT and IDQ is the idea of being able to have what we call a trusted compute cells based on a biological model. So it's recombinatory, it's self-healing, and the idea is that you're able to define your own network, that then you have a rule engine, rule sets that execute, and it's actually jurisdiction aware because it has a GPS, so it knows what rules work and what. I mean, this is ongoing work, but it's complex. It's how do you make it simple? How do you make it scalable? All these things. But it argues that you're going to really have to deal with how the marriage of technology and new technology with the legal frameworks.
Yes.
That you're just, I mean, I was at Berkman Center before I was at MIT and so-called law lab, and there's it's sort of how do you apply technology to law? How do you write contracts that are self-executing and things like that? So I think but you find that the authorities right now they're not even thinking this way at all. So you're going to have to do something, I would assume, through some kind of private law. I totally agree with the idea of a community and a commons, because that's what we look at. We sort of adopted Eleanor Ostrom's notions of a governance as a commons. But what's the boundaries of that? And how do you define it? And what's the interoperability between the boundaries?
Can I interject
Sure.
first before we get to that? Because that's an important point. But I think the interesting thing is that the systems actually are becoming more federated and granular and organic-ish.
Right.
The lawmakers, not necessarily even the law, are digital. They're either, it's technically impossible, it can't possibly, or something magic happens, and I can wave my wand and say, produce all the data, delete all the
That's
data,
right.
make it dance and sing for me, and it's very digital. And when, one of my kind of aha moments was 2 years I was in France for a meeting, and a very well-educated someone in our community came up and said, Michelle, did you know about the new spyware? And I said, probably not, but okay, bring it on. The IP address. And I said, the what? The IP address. So this staffer thought that the IP address was a new piece of spyware because they just recently heard that people could track using the IP address, and that's why it's being debated as a piece of personal information, and I can't believe these American companies, and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, gosh, it's not a piece of spyware, that is the internet. But it is so illustrative that that is someone writing complaint letters and asking for data and getting us into these litigation cycles. You must respond as an entity, and you must invest in that response. And I'm not spending any time investing on protecting my data center when I'm hiring French lawyers to answer something about the IP address as some sort of virus.
But what you're saying implicitly is that the whole process.
That didn't happen, by the way. It's just a conversation.
But the whole idea of notification, participation, people making informed judgments, all of that process is sort of a part of the rational actor model of Enlightenment thinking, and we know through a lot of biology that's not really the way people work. But that whole process of governance is sort of doesn't scale in this sense. I mean, if that's the case, then what's the replacement?
Yeah, you can't know. So I'm not suggesting that suddenly, like, every citizen, and particularly ones that want to go into politics, become the Illuminati suddenly overnight.
No,
but
I'm
I
not
do think
saying-
you can be a lot more. You can model and have much more transparent. Like his new company Shape, which is in stealth mode. I've just learned. Yeah, I'm envisioning the children's box in my mind. Where you put a box in front of a kid and they've got like stars and moons, and the shape fits the context. I think you can do that for lawmakers. They need a shape sorter box, and you can say, okay, today we're talking about wrongful sharing.
That's not exactly what.
No.
No. But that's what it brought to mind. I thought, oh, that would be cool.
But the point was made here that rather than rules, go to principles, and I think that as a principle based, and you provide safe harbor provisions that you can have innovations within those sets of principles, and that's where you can have innovation in governance and rulemaking. That I think where that can be a genuine technology. I'm sorry, Stefan.
Yeah. So I like to also criticize policymakers all the time, but I also
We do
want
love
to.
that.
Yes.
Any of you in the
But
audience, please
I
don't
do
regulate
want
me.
to also say is that I haven't seen a solution coming from the tech companies either, and so I think we have to just be honest that this is hard and complex, and that we're moving into an environment where data exchange and data disclosure is happening all the time. And so we're going to have to come up, as I said, with some real new ways of thinking about, under what conditions are certain kinds of uses harmful and certain kinds of uses beneficial to a certain extent. Now, in addition to that, one of the big advances in psychology, to a certain extent, as it relates to governance, has been the behavioral science environment, right? Where you ultimately nudge, anyway, to use Cass Sunstein's overused term, where you nudge people to do certain things that are more beneficial for them. So the question here is, to what extent can you actually nudge people by the way the technology is architect, nudge people to not put them in a position where their information might be abused against their idea, and that requires a different default developed by the tech companies than we currently have. And so if we talk about default, I think the tech companies have a responsibility, or at least should start thinking about what's the default that nudges people into a behavior that is privacy protective as opposed to more sharing for sharing purposes. And I think those two elements need to be developed.
But maybe be a little perverse on this, because in a lot of there's financial incentives for current companies to bleed the data, not to give the user control. So the more data that's generated, the more data they have access to, and in an exclusive way, the more revenue they generate. So you're running write debt against a business and revenue model as
Right.
well, right?
Yeah, and so, but
okay,
that- yes.
I'd like to-
So I think that you have a fascinating observation. I think that the tech companies have done something in terms of being able to move the ball forward as far as social norms that are privacy friendly. And I think that what those social norms have sort of turned into is an awareness that anything that you put into the internet, into an information retrieval system, could potentially be public at some point. So you see this sort of life cycle of using social networks and sharing information on various public, private channels. And you see initially a great deal of enthusiasm with which people add friends, they add all kinds of information on there, and then after a while,
Yes.
they start to contract a little bit. They start to learn about privacy policies. And then over a longer period of time, they start to be more conservative as far as how much information they put on there. And that's something that has a generational component to it as well. So you see folks who are younger often sharing more and sharing more freely than folks that are older. And I think that when you have that type of stance, when you realize that subject to a data breach or subject to a mistake, you can have all kinds of information that you intended to tag as private being made public. And as a result of that, you're just more conservative with what you share overall because you know that it can end up on the front page of the New York Times.
But it's
Then
beyond
that's
that.
privacy friendly.
Yeah, but it's beyond that. I think you're still framing it in terms of sort of pictures and things. When we really think about when you're the Internet of Things, it's not only that, it's your location data, it's your hot monitor, it's where you're going. I mean, and that can be gathered, and the analytics can be done down the pipe, and they can nudging. You talk about machine learning, taking all the data, they'll nudge you. Why am I going to the store at this time? Why am I buying these things? You know, that's the kind of nudge. That's where the money's going to go, and you have no idea. I mean, if you look at the Moto X phone, the sensors are on. You don't know they're on. You can't turn them off. You can smash it, you can turn it off, but that's about the only way you can opt out. So this is hardly an open society that we're creating, and, and there are financial incentives to make it that way.
And that's why I think privacy advocates and privacy experts play such an important role with those new technologies to educate the entire community about what those pieces of data could be used for. So the defaults are really, as you said, something that are implemented behind the scenes, and the vast majority of users are unaware of the data that's being collected. So as an industry, we have to try and think about what does it mean for this particular piece of data to be collected by this device.
But self-policing industries have not been terribly successful in the past.
Well, I think that you have to look at the long-term incentive as well. So at Google, one of the things that we always believed in was that you have to try and maximize for the long term as opposed to for the next quarter. So I think the way that we implemented advertising from the very beginning based on what a user is typing into a search engine as opposed to looking at other pieces of data, I think that that is a nice
Google
model.
now, I mean, to be fair, Google now does the mining across, it does your Gmail, it does your location data, it's using all of them, and your search data.
Well,
so it's probably the most surveillant system out there.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think that there are a number of companies that have access to similar views of data across the internet and across various devices. And one of the things that we have to figure out as a society is what policies do we want to implement on all of those companies collectively, as well as new companies. So new companies are going to come up with new technologies that implement new types of tracking as well.
Give you a chance to speak.
So I mean, I think we have to disentangle access to information by the government and access to information by companies. We've been sort of talking with them together. I think most people kind of know that Google has a lot of information about us, and they know that Google uses big data to run algorithms and figure out cool stuff. And whenever Google figures something out beyond advertising, they talk about it and they advertise, and we kind of know what's going on. But people were shocked to hear about the sort of called PRISM program, where the NSA had direct access or some kind of access to the same information. Right? People were surprised to hear about the Verizon program, about the cable tapping program, because they didn't think the government had access to all that information, and the government wasn't really transparent about it. And so when you look at the sort of the threats and the benefits of turning over all that information to the government versus private companies, I think there's a very different analysis, and both when it comes to security and when it comes to like the benefits of big data.
But governments can then have through contractors get the information. They can't themselves allow, they can get it through contractors. So
If the law permitted it, right?
Where the law does permit it.
That's right,
Okay,
that's right.
so, I mean, so the division is a murky one to begin with.
So as a result, privacy advocates tend to argue that companies shouldn't have access to this data because they know that no matter what, if you have this honeypot of data, the government will get it.
Right.
And so maybe you can set up institutions, perhaps, that could keep the government from getting the honeypot of data, or you're in a situation where you have privacy advocates and maybe society arguing even the big companies shouldn't have access to that data. And I think there would be cost to that, considering that companies can do some interesting stuff with data.
Do you want to comment? Then we'll open it up to,
Well,
we want to open
meaning
up the floor.
I
to-
agree, but again, it comes back, meaning, would you disagree that in order to prevent a terrorist attack, government should not have access to data? So it's like... meaning,
Wait.
No,
That's
I
the
agree.
usual way it's framed, but we often make the trade-off between security and privacy.
Right.
When you go to the Supreme Court, you can be there, sitting there in front of the justices. We don't wall them off. We don't have them behind
Gotcha.
security.
No,
Right? We
I'm
have
all-
a trade-off every day.
I
And-
agree, but I'm just saying that, meaning, I think we need to have a far more, I totally
sure.
agree.
There is a
I'm not
balance,
going to
though.
say that,
Yeah.
but I think we need to have a far more sophisticated debate about under what conditions. And I think that's
nuanced.
not, meaning, it's like, to a certain extent, I was surprised that people got so upset, because it's almost like, wow, there was gambling in the casino, right?
Yeah, that's
And
what I
and
was surprised
but
about.
then
Why
the
are you
question-
surprised?
The question then is, meaning, okay, there was gambling that clearly went beyond what was, so
I mean,
and
if it
think-
was unsurprising, it shouldn't have been secret. I mean, there's a reason why they kept
I
it
know,
secret, because they
I
thought
know,
people would
but
be
anyway,
surprised.
I'm not advocating that this was a good thing, but I'm just advocating is that we have to move beyond, you cannot have access to data, and we have to go and have a debate about under what conditions, for what purposes, and as a society, we haven't gone there, and I think we should not limit ourselves to government use of data.
Right.
I think we should have the open debate about under what conditions, and for what purposes can government have access to certain kinds of, companies have access to certain
We
kinds
have, we have
of
some
data.
active hands here, so we're going to open it. David, you were particularly,
No, I have
to
a question
fo-
that you might like, John. One of the things that I've stumbled across recently that I thought was very interesting in regard to the NSA thing and the prospect that all these big companies were secretly or unknown to their customers cooperating quite extensively with the government was something that I'm embarrassed. I can't. What's the name of the company that makes the nonprofit that does Firefox?
Mozilla.
Mozilla. Thank you. I was talking to a senior
Like
Mozilla
LinkedIn,
person
yes.
the other day, and I remember what he says, even if I don't remember the company name. And he was arguing that open source might be a very effective defense against this kind of thing, because when tools that are widely used are developed collectively, the code is much more visible to the entire community, and backdoors are essentially, he argued, impossible to impose. Certainly if the NSA tried to put a backdoor into Mozilla software in Firefox, the chances of somebody finding it might be a lot greater than if it's in Microsoft or Google. I just thought that was a very interesting point of view, especially given your advocacy, John, that we're moving toward a world where that's sort of the way everything's going to happen. Thought it'd be worth asking the panel.
well, of course, I am very sympathetic to that point of view, but if someone wants to respond to that?
Well, I am a strong advocate of open source, but I will say the companies are desperately trying to get permission to tell the citizenry what has been going on. You see, there's active
Well, that's true.
lawsuits, there's
Yeah, that's
active
right.
petitions, and I have no inside information, but I believe that corporations tend to be fairly economically rational, and if there were a back doors in all of this software, they would not be pushing to be allowed to tell us. And also, we have some pretty good information that's some closed source software. So, for example, look at the attacks on the Belgian Cisco routers. They hacked into those routers. If you go into your house, if you have a key, do you climb through the second floor window? So I think we have some information that gives us cause for confidence. in the software. That being said, Ken Thompson showed that you can put malware in open source software. Remember that?
Yeah, okay.
And, but I'm a huge advocate for openness where it's appropriate.
So okay, Judy?
I have a question. I just wanted to follow
Okay.
up on what you were saying. I just want to have an understanding. Do you feel that individuals are more concerned about privacy issues with the government than about privacy issues with companies collecting information? Because there's not an equal understanding of what companies are doing with the information they're collecting. So I would think that people would have the same concerns with companies doing certain things with the information that they're getting. Everyone doesn't know that when they're searching through Google or whatever, that information is being used by Google for marketing purposes. So, just a question.
I think people are concerned about both, but I think people are more concerned about the government because, mainly because of the history of abuse of the government and the fact that the government has, sort of monopoly over the ability to fine you, imprison you, things like that.
It depends where you are, though. It's very, very culturally sensitive who you fear more. In certain European countries, they're very happy to be filmed by the government and have tons of data processed, but private industry is much more suspect.
So we had a lot of people write in to Google about privacy issues, and there are privacy issues along the lines of what you were mentioning. What data does Google have and what can it do with it? But by far the most common privacy issue that people write in to Google about is related to nothing to do with data retention. It has to do with the fact that Google as a search engine makes data which is public from other websites easy to find. So what they're concerned about is all of a sudden their name comes up on a Google search on some other website. So they write into Google and say, please take this down, but it's actually not data coming from Google in the first place.
Right. Sammy?
One particular, related to the government issue, it seems to me that you can have discussions of sort of nuanced uses of data, but if you have gathered all this information, government is notoriously not transparent, and also the dynamics of what is going to be used changes rather dramatically and can do so rather quickly. As you were saying, what are we going to do in the face of terrorism, which is essentially an endless war? And so, it seems to me that concern about the government control over large amounts of information or access to large amounts of information because of the ill uses that can be put to, if not by a current administration, by a later one, then that's a huge concern. And the issue of, it goes beyond to where one is entering information or tracking online information, because an increasing amount of information can then be placed online by all sorts of surveillance devices which are becoming broadly available. So I wonder, about the transparency of society as a whole. Is it futile to try and protect information broadly in some way? If you look at project technology forward just a few decades and the kinds of things that are going to be, surveyed in one way or another.
But can I ask a question back? Because you have a huge expertise in genetic information, and so how? Because the genetic information there was a decision that certain users were not allowed with regard to the genetic information that you have. So how does that model play out in this environment? This is a question back here. Yeah.
Well, when you look at it, genetics, it's interesting because there was a whole discussion about privacy. Our biology should be private. And anyone who knows anything, it seems to me, would listen to that and said, this is a silly conversation. There is no privacy there. If anybody wants to identify your genetics and look at it, it's available to them because you leave a trail of biological debris behind you. It's in public. It's like saying, oh, well, we wouldn't want somebody to put a picture of me drinking beer on the internet. Well, when there's such an opportunity that anybody can take photography of a person in public and there are all sorts of recordings and such can be made, it becomes very difficult to see these sorts of things.
Well, but I think there's a difference in legal principles in the sense that, yes, the data will flow, it'll be there, But the obligations, the harms come when you actually tend to use it in a particular way that's
Exactly.
prohibited. There's where the duties,
So you cannot
that's where the
use- so you
duties of
cannot
the
use
crew.
it for
Not the
for
fact that you
particular
leave it
decisions.
around, it's how it's used.
So,
Yeah.
But we need to-
even with the use of the data, you can make arguments about that, but it's very difficult to control
And
that.
you're
in other
equating it with
institutional-
secrecy. It's not secrecy. That's the other thing,
Yeah.
is that
Yeah.
makes it very difficult to code to that, because what you're talking about is obscurity and secrecy. And you're right, there's a prevalence there, but it's a much more textured nuance about, am I allowed to be naked in Times Square? I'll probably be arrested. Am I allowed to be naked in Times Square in a doctor's office? Yes. And there's credentialing and all sorts of groovy things that happen there. If it's like next door at like some dragon show, it's probably something totally different.
So one component of this problem that I didn't hear much about is something that always is the concluding thing with the discussions that I help lead at the World Economic Forum, which is there's technology, there's regulation, but there's also norms. And one of the big things you need to do is you need to establish well-understood, broadly applicable norms within communities, because they'll be different in different communities, about what to do and when to do it. And obviously, it's not a perfect solution, but technology doesn't solve everything by itself. Regulation isn't going to do it. You need to have people understanding something about when it's good to do what. And the sort of thing that's typically talked about are the sort of things like with Creative Commons, where there's clear marking for maybe 4 different methods of interaction. In one, you're guaranteed, top security and the data will absolutely disappear in 3 months, and there's enormous legal ramifications if they don't do it. And another one, it's a little skull and crossbones, and it's the way we have it today. So I don't know if you folks have a response to that, but I just say that that's the third leg of the stool.
Want to respond to that?
Right now, our norms are being established by default in a way that's not respectful of communities. So the most popular app on all the phones combined, well, I don't know about Windows phones, is a flashlight app. The permissions for that application are insane. They know your location, they know all your friends, they can charge you money. So basically, there's no way for you to assert your own norm. There's no way to say, I would like a flashlight that just works and I will pay you, $2 in Bitcoin. Or I would like a flashlight that just works, but I'm not that paranoid, so I'll just pay you with my credit card. So we can build systems that empower communities to enforce their own norms, and that also understand that each of us is a member of very many different communities in very many different roles. So one of the test apps, for example, that they did at IU was they created a Facebook layer so that your post only went up, or if a post, so I take a picture of everybody and your names are identified. It's only shared after either you say it's okay or after a couple of your friends say it's okay. So it allows you to collaboratively develop norms. And because of the age group, there was like a sobriety test too that I don't think most people need. But we can build technologies to enable communities to develop their own norms, but those do go in the face of near-term financial interest.
That's right.
I don't think it goes in the face of long-term financial interest, but it definitely impacts business plans in the near term.
We got just one more minute. Or just follow up? Sure.
Because it's against the short-term interests of a lot of smaller companies that are feeding off of the gray areas. But I've had many conversations with the CEOs of major corporations who are desperate for those sorts of norms.
Right.
Because it will enable
Yeah, it's a lot
trusted
easier.
commerce. It'll get them out of the sort of quagmire
Litigation.
local jurisdiction regulation of establishing methods of doing things that are cross-cutting. So, yeah, there'll be losers, but there'll also be a lot of big winners.
We build demos, they
We
build
got 2
products.
minutes left. We have 2
Do
minutes
it.
left.
They should do it.
So, what was it? Okay, well, Jody? then
This
we-
lady has been waiting
Okay,
the whole
other-
time.
So let me challenge the privacy people a little bit in that what I find is privacy is a good concept and people talk it, but it doesn't get a lot of walk. In my 2010 Scilab governance survey, 80% of the respondents of the Fortune 1000 did not have a chief privacy officer. In 2012, 82% of the Forbes Global 2000 respondents did not have a chief privacy officer. And so we talk about privacy, and it's important, and I'm not saying it's not, but what I see it happen is it collides with several things. It collides with weaknesses and technical vulnerabilities that are exploited. It collides with the realities of business practices. Suddenly someone wants to do something else with the data. They're not really checking what did we say we were going to do with it. It collides with weak security programs, or in many companies, the privacy people don't know how to integrate security into the privacy into the security program. Yep. It collides with cybercrime because the criminals are out there getting the data. It collides with nation-state activities. If the nation-state wants to collect data, they're going to collect it at the peering point, at the border gateway, at the provider, and it doesn't matter what you have in your company. And then lastly, it collides with the realities of big data, where there's huge amounts of data pools out there, huge amounts being retained that can be correlated. So even if you have privacy settings, it can get defeated by just doing that. So it's a very difficult problem. The privacy by design is helping because it's a concept to put it in the system development lifecycle, and that's good because it makes people plan it into the system and think about it all the way through. But I think that the privacy conversation just has to kind of close with the thought of, you may have privacy, but is there any securities to support it?
Yeah, so I'll dive into that.
Yeah, okay.
I've been walking this walk for a very long time. I had collagen back when it started. So when I started in this role, I was at Sun Microsystems at the time. I think there were 5 of us, planetary-wide CPOs, and it was a title that we studiously sat together in a room with Harriet and a few other first-name basis type privacy folks and said, what are we going to do? How are we going to call this? So the fact that I'm not terribly, terribly old and still can credibly dye my hair means that we're just in the beginning of this. You know, in tort law terms, Mrs. Palsgraf is laying, bleeding on the scales right now. We haven't figured out the zone of danger. We don't have the right tools yet. But I'm still tremendously hopeful. The conversation I was having in the 2000 and even right after 9/11, when we were in this hump of, oh my God, there's no privacy, get over it, everyone, give all your data to the government and something magical and alchemy will happen. But I don't start presentations with what is privacy anymore. And I did that for a good 5 years. I don't start conversations with what is privacy by design, which is a great aspirational policy concept. So I'm kind of walking the walk and literally walking the walk. I'm embarrassed in front of real scientists. I'm writing a book called Privacy Engineering, going from policy to code to QA to value, because I think that's the chain. You know, there's other people, you know, Jeff, who do the real thing. But the reason I'm writing the book, I'm writing it with my dad, who started out in mainframe computing when there was no governance over technology. I mean, people were still burning down labs because they couldn't get the cabling right. So I'm very hopeful. It can happen, even in the face of big data. I think sometimes because of big data can recognize who you are and authenticate you on the fly, and no one can steal that one credential as they can steal that one credential, which is your static social security number, completely unprotected by Washington. So there's a lot of hope here too, but I totally listen to her. If you don't have a CPO, go get one. We have job recs for you. I have written papers about how to integrate your privacy and security program. Please, please, please.
Okay, well that we're going to have to, and I'm sorry, there are other questions. We couldn't get all the
I know this poor lady.
questions, but sorry about that. Well, thank you very much and for the panel. Great active discussion. Continue later.